Hello, our topic is astrology and the Rig Veda, and this presentation is a continuation of the video, The History of Astrology, but you don't have to go back to that video, The History of Astrology. This video also stands by itself perfectly well. Now, in that video, The History of Astrology, I present the standard understanding of the earliest forms of astrology, which I'm going to refer to here as Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 1 is the Omen astrology that was practiced approximately from 2500 BC to 500 BC, and then around 500 BC astrology makes a huge transition, a huge change, and this new form of astrology is now referred to as Hellenistic astrology. So in the range of about 500 BC to 100 BC, there's this huge transformation of astrology, and this transformation continues to be practiced until maybe 400, 500, or 600 AD, and then we move on to Phase 3, where astrology begins to move geographically to a different area, the center of astrology, and starts to change again. So this is accurate. There are these two periods of astrology. I just want to emphasize two additional points. Point number one is not to underestimate Babylonian astrology. Sometimes we get this feeling about the Babylonian period that people are wandering around in the desert, occasionally looking up at the sky, randomly seeing something and making some superstition out of it. I just want to point out that the evidence is that some people spent huge amounts of time observing the sky. This was a serious and continued study on and off for 2,000 years. And the results of these observations is that the Babylonians were able to calculate the positions of planets with impressive accuracy. They could also predict when eclipses occur. That's impressive, because in order to predict when eclipses will occur, you have to have observations from generation to generation, where that information is passed on from generation to generation, refined, careful records kept. So clearly the Babylonians were engaged in a serious long-term study to understand how celestial events are changing over time. There are extensive celestial observations. I just want to make that clear, and that later astronomy and astrology would not have developed without this basis. Just wanted to mention that to make that point clear. And an example of the dedication to astronomy and astrology. This is in the latter part of that Babylonian Omen astrology period. I'll quote from Wikipedia. Ashurbanipal was a king of Assyria who ruled in the 7th century BC from 668 to 625 BC. He was famous for assembling a great library of cuneiform tablets in Nineveh on the subjects of astrology, history, mythology, and science. Some of Ashurbanipal's astrologers, such as Ramanu Samasar and Nabu Musisi, became so adept at deducing omens from daily movements of the planets that a system of making periodical reports to the king came into being. So here we see a great library on astrology, history, mythology, science, the dedication to learning. And that then we're practicing astrologers before 500 BC. We know that there are astrologers reporting to the king on a daily basis in the 7th century BC and probably before that. So just an example of some of the activities going on in Babylonia. All right. So that was my point number one. Point number two, and in some ways this is even more exciting, and this is really new for a lot of us, is there is evidence of astrology, strong evidence of astrology, and even something that sounds like a zodiac in the Rig Veda. So this, the reason I'm mentioning this is that this idea that we have these two phases, the Omen astrology phase for 2,000 years, followed by the Hellenistic astrology phase, and Hellenistic astrology is a lot like modern astrology. So we go from superstitions to modern astrology seemingly almost overnight. And what I'm pointing out is that this transition from superstitions to modern, an astrology that sounds very modern, is not as completely sudden as it might seem. Number one, the Babylonian astrology is not just people wandering around making up a few superstitions. There's more to it. And number two, there is some evidence of ideas that sound more modern in some of the ancient works. And one of them is the Rig Veda. So what is the Rig Veda? It's an ancient Indian sacred collection of Vedic Sanskrit hymns. It is counted among the four canonical sacred texts of Hinduism known as the Vedas. It is one of the oldest extant texts in the Indo-European language. Philological and linguistic evidence indicates the Rig Veda was composed in the northwestern region of the Indian subcontinent, most likely between 1500 and 1200 BC. A wider approximation would be 1700 to 1100 BC. So this is one of the oldest texts available, period. And we see astrology in it. That's pretty amazing, and it sounds almost like a zodiac. I'll read you some of the excerpts from it, and you can see for yourself what you think of this. I think this is quite fascinating. So in the video on the history of astrology, one of the first things I present are some of the omens from the Babylonian cuneiforms around 1700 BC. This is from the Asian continent. In the Sanskrit language, pretty close in time, probably between 1500 and 1200, somewhere around there, a little bit later than that. But the language is quite different and quite interesting. Here's a quote from the Rig Veda. "The wheel of law with 12 spokes does not decay as it revolves around heaven. O fire, here your 720 suns abide." So it's not this omen stuff that I went over in the tutorial on the history of astrology. It's kind of a mythical sort of language, a metaphorical language, the wheel of law with 12 spokes. The 12 spokes sound a lot like the zodiac signs. They sound more like zodiac signs and constellations, because constellations have different sizes. You get this image that a wheel, this undecaying, it does not decay, this eternal wheel, this fixed wheel in the heavens, is supported by 12 spokes. And if we take that image literally, we know that when you put spokes in a wheel, you make them evenly distributed. We know that the spokes support the wheel. It really gives an impression that you're talking about zodiac signs. Now, what are the 720 suns? It appears that these might be half degrees. So 360 times 2. That the 720 divisions, that they might have been using even half-degree divisions is a possibility. Now here's another quote. 7 yoke the chariot that has a single wheel. 1 horse that has 7 names carries it. The wheel has 3 naves, is undecaying, and never overcome, where all these beings are placed. Again, the undecaying wheel of life. Speculation here is that the 7 refer to the Sun and Moon and the 5 visible planets. So you have Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. So very, very interesting, this metaphorical language. Here's another quote. Revolving on this 5-spoked wheel. Okay, so we had 12 spokes before. Now it's talking about a 5-spoked wheel. Revolving on this 5-spoked wheel, all being stand, though it carries a heavy load, its axle does not overheat. From of old, it does not break its ancient laws. So this is getting clearer and clearer that these are the immutable, eternal laws of nature. And here there are 5 spokes. Now, I've read some commentaries on this suggesting that the 5 spokes might be the 5 visible planets. Each planet, perhaps, is seen as on its own wheel. If you take this more literally, I also suspect that perhaps this is saying they did not use just a zodiac of 12 signs. Maybe they had a zodiac of 5 signs. They divided the sky into various pieces. So there's a 12-spoked wheel, 5-spoked wheel. In any case, they're clearly talking about the heavens. They're talking about the movement of the planets. This is clearly some form of astrology. Here's another quote. The undecaying wheel, again undecaying, over and over again. The undecaying wheel together with its circumference, 10 yoked to the upward extension carry it. The eye of the sun moves encompassing the region. In it are placed all beings. So clearly we're talking about the movement of the sun through the sky, which is the same area of the sky where the planets move. 10 yoked to the upward extension carry it. I've read different commentaries on it, but it sounds to me like the area of the sky that the planets move through and the sun moves through is seen as an undecaying wheel, and the eternal laws of nature, and they're divided into equal sections. So it gives an impression of something like zodiac signs. We know that some of the earliest zodiacs were not always based on 12. There were other ideas, such as basing it on 18 is mentioned in Babylonia. We have the 27 nakshatras. Personally, the impression I'm getting from this is the idea that the sky, specifically that ecliptic plane region where the sun and the planets move, can be divided into various fixed sections like spokes that sustain it and convey these eternal laws, or they are the eternal laws by which we live. Okay, so the conclusion from this. Hellenistic astrology was clearly a time when astrological ideas were framed in a new way and many new rules were developed. No one's going to question that. That's very clear. Some of the ideas in Hellenistic astrology had roots in earlier forms of astrology. Of course they did. They took the Babylonian omens and constructed a form of logical rules based on those ideas. The question is exactly how much of Hellenistic astrology is new and how much of it is based on earlier traditions. And this is likely we'll never know. It appears that a large amount of Hellenistic astrology is new, but is inspired by earlier ideas. This is what seems to be coming out from the latest research as we see these sections of the Rig Veda, for example, clearly referring to some kind of division of the ecliptic plane into what sounds like fixed areas, sounds a lot like a zodiac. There seems to be these threads of ideas going way, way back, and we don't know how far back because the Rig Veda is one of the oldest texts that we have. So I think this is interesting. We do know that our astrology today is descended directly from Hellenistic astrology. As I mentioned in the video on the history of astrology, even if there are very sophisticated forms of astrology going way, way back, it doesn't really affect where our astrology came from, which came very strongly from Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. So we have that very, very clear lineage based in Hellenistic astrology. But it is fascinating to see how Hellenistic astrology developed and evolved. Okay, thank you very much for listening. God bless. Namaste.